Welcome to the Deep Dive, a deep dive tailored just for you. We've got some absolutely wild material on the table today.
Yeah, this one's pretty out there.
It's excerpts from a paper called How Morphisms Map the Mind, a Radical Phenomenalist Perspective.
And it really doesn't pull any punches, does it?
Not at all. So our mission really in this deep dive is to try and grapple with its core idea, which is, well, what if everything we understand, everything we call reality, just exists purely inside our own experience?
Right, like no need for an outside world to, ground it all.
Exactly. And maybe even more mind-bending.
Uh-huh.
How could advanced mathematics, specifically category theory, actually give us a kind of rigorous map for navigating this completely internal landscape?
Yeah, that's the really wild part. Mapping the mind with math.
So we're going to unpack this radical phenomenalist claim, this idea that basically external reality is kind of beside the point when it comes to meaning.
And then explore how these structural relationships within our minds, the patterns, the connections, mapped by things like morphisms, how they could build a perfectly coherent internal world.
Right, and crucially how this internal structure alone could account for things we usually think need an outside world, like understanding something, or even spotting illusions or dreams, all from the inside out.
Yeah. So get ready for your assumptions about, well, what meaning and reality even are to get a serious workout today.
Okay, so let's jump right into the deep end of this radical phenomenalist idea. Where does the paper really start?
Well, it lays out its fundamental premise pretty clearly. Everything we know, everything we experience is basically confined to what they call the theater of our own experience.
The theater of experience. I like that.
And meaning, reference, they don't reach outside this theater. They're described as purely internal, experiential, and predictive.
Okay, so the mind is like a self-contained simulator. It's only concerned with how one, internal state or experience leads to the next one.
Pretty much, yeah. And this is where the radical part really hits home. Concepts that seem to point beyond our experience.
Yeah.
Like Kant's things in themselves.
Or just the idea of an objective physical world existing whether we see it or not.
Exactly. Those are deemed semantically void. Basically meaningless.
Pseudo-concepts, as the paper puts it. Which makes sense, I guess, in their view. If you can't access it, interact with it, or predict anything based on it within your own experience,
then talking about it doesn't actually add any meaning for you. Like it doesn't connect to anything inside.
Right.
They use a great analogy. Imagine a word in a totally private language, a word you just made up in your head.
Okay.
If that word has absolutely no connections to any experience you've ever had, no links to any other idea or feeling or memory, it's just empty, semantically speaking.
It doesn't point anywhere inside your mental world. Doesn't do anything.
It adds nothing. It's just noise.
I see. It's almost like a variable in a computer program that's declared but never actually used or given a value. It's there in the code, maybe, but it doesn't affect the outcome. It doesn't mean anything in the running of the program.
That's a really good parallel, actually. And this whole perspective, it kind of echoes some other ideas out there, like in linguistics. Chomsky's internalist semantics.
Where language isn't primarily about connecting words to things out there in the world.
Right, but more about linking words to mental concepts inside your head. Meaning it becomes more like a set of instructions for building and relating concepts internally.
So when I say apple, it's not really referring to the fruit on the table. It's triggering my internal concept ABLE.
Exactly. And what we call the real world. In this view, it's just our most consistent, most useful internal model for predicting the patterns within our ongoing stream of experience.
So the feeling of correspondence to an external world is just the model working really well, the simulation being very consistent and predictive.
Precisely. The simulation just happens to be, very, very good at generating a coherent, predictable flow of experiences.
Okay, but that immediately brings up the huge question, doesn't it? The sort of central problem this whole view has to solve.
It is.
If meaning and reality are only inside your head, if there's no external anchor at all, how on earth does your mind stay coherent? How do you maintain a stable, consistent, predictable internal world that doesn't just, dissolve into random noise?
Yes. The coherence problem. And that is precisely where the paper introduces its big proposed solution.
Which is?
The answer, they argue, lies entirely in structure.
Structure? But structure of what if there's nothing external to structure it around?
That's the twist. When you throw out the idea of external reference, the relationships between your experiences, the patterns, the ways one experience leads to or predicts or resembles another, those relationships become the only thing left to provide semantic coherence.
So structure isn't imposed from outside, it is the meaning built purely from internal connections.
Yes, it's all about the internal web of relations. And this is where they bring in the heavy-duty math.
Right, category theory.
This is where they propose category theory as the language, maybe even the underlying logic for describing how these internal experiences relate and predict and refer to each other based purely on their structural properties.
So it gives us a formal toolkit, a way to talk rigorously about the mind's internal architecture.
Kind of. It's presented as providing an internal geometry of mind, a way to chart the landscape of your experience using only its own internal coordinates. No need for an external map or compass.
Okay, my brain is already bending a little. So let's start simple if we can. What exactly is a morphism in this context? What's the sort of basic building block of this internal structure they're talking about?
Okay, yeah. At its most fundamental, in category theory, a morphism is just a structure-preserving mapping between two things, two objects.
Structure-preserving mapping. Okay. Still sounds a bit abstract. Can we make that more concrete?
Think of it like a reliable translator, maybe, or a connector. It takes elements from one setup and maps them to elements in another, but the crucial thing is it does so in a way that respects the original relationships.
Like mapping cities and roads from one map projection to another.
Exactly. The cities stay connected by the right roads in the new map, even if the overall shapes or distances look a bit different.
Okay, the connections, the structure is preserved.
Right. It's basically generalizing the idea of a mathematical function, but applying it more broadly anywhere you care about patterns and how those patterns are maintained when you shift perspective or move from one domain to another. It's all about how relationships in place A are reflected over in place B via this map, this morphism.
Got it. So it's a connector that respects the internal rules of whatever it's connecting. Now, the paper talks about different types of morphisms modeling different kinds of mental connections. What's the first one they bring up?
They start with a homomorphism. You can think of that one as modeling, say, structural similarity or finding a common pattern between things.
Okay, homomorphism. This is where you can keep the relationships, but maybe simplify things, lose some details, squish things down a bit.
Yes, exactly. A homomorphism preserves the important operations or relations. So if A is related to B in the source structure, then the mapping of A will be related to the mapping of B in the target structure in a corresponding way. But, and this is a key difference from other types, it can map several distinct things from the source onto just one single thing in the target.
Right. How does that relate to the mind then? What's it modeling for us?
Well, this is proposed as a model for things like understanding, abstraction, and generalization. Finding those simpler, more general patterns within all the complexity of raw experience. Think about how you form the concept chair.
Okay.
You've seen hundreds, maybe thousands of different physical chairs in your life, right?
Yeah.
All different shapes, sizes, materials.
Sure, yeah. Oak chairs, plastic chairs, bean bags.
But the mental mapping from each specific perception of a chair to your general concept chair, that mapping is proposed as a homomorphism. It preserves the essential functional relations like has a surface for sitting, supports weight, usually has legs, while abstracting away or collapsing all the specific details like the color, the material, the exact shape.
I see. So the concept chair in my head is like a simplified structural picture, a kind of quotient structure maybe of all those diverse chair experiences.
That's exactly the idea. Many distinct perceptual inputs get mapped onto a single, more abstract conceptual node. And here's the radical part in this view, that homomorphic mapping itself is what constitutes internal reference.
How do you mean?
The concept chair refers to all those specific chair experiences because it captures the common preserved structure shared across them entirely internally. It doesn't need to point to some external object labeled chair.
Okay. So internal reference is basically finding structural overlap via this kind of mapping.
Yes. And this is powerful because it allows for generalization and prediction. If you encounter a new situation, let's call it Y, and it shares enough structural features with a past situation X.
So there's a homomorphism from X to Y.
Right. Then you can predict that patterns or consequences you learned from X are likely to apply in Y too. Your mind is constantly, unconsciously performing this kind of homomorphic compression, boiling down experience into leaner, predictive models.
That sounds an awful lot like some ideas in neuroscience, like predictive coding or processing, where the brain builds models to anticipate sensory input.
The paper definitely makes that connection. The brain isn't trying to store every raw data point. It's building and refining models that capture the structural regularities in experience. The better the homomorphism, the better the mapping from a potential experience onto your internal model, the more successful your prediction, and you could say the richer your understanding or the meaning of that experience becomes.
They also use that metaphor example, time is a river. That's obviously not a perfect literal mapping.
No, exactly. And that's why it's a homomorphism, not the next type we'll get to. It maps some structural aspects, the sense of continuous flow, maybe irreversibility, perhaps even things like currents or eddies representing faster or slower periods.
Right.
But it totally ignores crucial rivery details like the water itself, the banks, the fish, whatever. The metaphor is meaningful only because of the internal structural overlap between our experience of time passing and our concept or experience of a river flowing.
It resonates internally because of that shared pattern.
Yes. The meaning comes from aligning these internal structures, not from somehow connecting the word time or river to some external independent reality out there.
Okay, so homomorphisms are about meaningful similarity, abstraction, generalization, keeping the core structure while allowing for variation and simplification, like a faithful but condensed summary.
That's a great way to put it, which naturally leads us to the sort of gold standard, the most special kind of homomorphism.
That's the isomorphism.
The isomorphism.
This is the perfect structural correspondence, right? The one-to-one and on to mapping.
Exactly. And isomorphism is a bijective homomorphism. Bijective just means it's both injective one-to-one, so no two different things in the source map, to the same thing in the target, and surjective onto, meaning everything in the target structure gets mapped to from something in the source. If two structures are isomorphic, they are, for all intents and purposes, structurally identical.
Indistinguishable, purely based on their structure.
Precisely. You could swap their labels and all the internal relationships, all the operations, they'd still hold perfectly. You can map from A to B, and crucially, you can map back from B to A with an inverse mapping without losing or gaining anything structurally.
The paper calls it like holding a polished mirror up to the mind, seeing the exact same pattern reflected.
Yeah. And in a purely internal world, recognizing that something is structurally the same as something else, that's incredibly powerful.
So like realizing two completely different experiences actually have the exact same underlying form or pattern.
Think about that vivid dream example they use. You have a dream where you're navigating some really complex, maybe frustrating social situation. Then later, maybe days later, you have this sudden realization. That dream scenario had the exact same pattern of relationships, the same power dynamics, the same conflicts, maybe even the same kind of outcome as a situation that's currently unfolding at your office.
Ah, I see. The specific details are totally different. The people, the setting.
Completely different. But the structure, the network of relations is identical.
And that moment of realization, wow, that dream was structurally identical to my office drama. That's recognizing the isomorphism.
That's recognizing the isomorphism, yes. And according to this radical phenomenalist view, that discovery, that internal mapping, is what gives those two experiences a shared meaning or significance for you. The dream isn't referring to an external office. It's referring internally to the structurally identical pattern you're experiencing in relation to your work.
This feels very connected to ideas from cognitive science about analogical reasoning, doesn't it? We're always looking for that structural alignment, not just surface similarities.
Exactly. Our minds are constantly, often unconsciously, searching for isomorphisms, or at least strong homomorphisms, between different internal domains. That's how we find deeper connections and transfer knowledge. It's this structural constraint of isomorphism, the drive to find the mapping that preserves the most relationships.
Like an internal structural resonance.
That's a nice phrase for it. Like two mental tuning forks starting to hum together because their internal structures align perfectly. And importantly, this doesn't need an external reality to confirm the match. The match is confirmed internally by the quality of the structural alignment itself.
So isomorphisms define these internal equivalences. These two experiences, despite appearances, are the same structurally. Could this be the basis for an internal notion of truth? Or maybe reference?
It's definitely leaning that way. A thought could be considered true relative to a perception, perhaps, if the internal conceptual structure generated by the thought is isomorphic to the internal structure generated by the perception.
Or a memory refers to a past event.
Not by linking to some external moment lost in time, but by being structurally isomorphic to the original stored experience pattern. When there's a perfect structural match, the mind essentially treats them as interchangeable for internal processing, for prediction.
So good analogies, powerful metaphors, they work because they reveal these hidden isomorphisms or strong homomorphisms between different areas of our internal experience.
Absolutely. A really insightful metaphor uncovers a shared relational pattern that wasn't obvious before. And its predictive power comes from being able to apply knowledge based on that structural correspondence, which, again, in this model is purely internal.
Makes sense. The paper does note, though, that perfect isomorphisms are probably quite rare in our actual messy experience.
Oh, for sure. Much rarer than homomorphisms. We're usually dealing with partial matches approximations. But the ideal of isomorphism, that perfect structural mirroring, might be what drives our cognitive search for true equivalences, for getting things exactly right internally.
Okay, so that covers mappings between potentially different structures. What about mappings that happen within a single structure? The paper talks about those too, right? Like the mind modeling itself.
Yes, that brings us to endomorphisms and automorphisms.
Endomorphism first. Endo meaning within. So a structure preserving map from a structure back onto itself.
Exactly. It's a transformation you perform on some internal structure, say, a memory or a concept. But the result of the transformation is still within that same structure or domain. Mentally, this could model internal operations or transitions that change something about your state while keeping the fundamental structure intact.
Like reframing a memory, looking back on something differently.
That's a perfect example. You revisit a memory maybe years later, and you see it in a completely new light. You might change the emotional tone associated with it or integrate new information you've learned since then about the context.
But the core sequence of events, the main relationships between the people or actions involved, that underlying structure remains preserved.
Right, so the memory viewed in the old way maps to the memory viewed in the new way via an endomorphism. It represents an internal transition that preserves certain crucial invariants, even while other aspects change.
Okay. And an automorphism. That's a special kind of endomorphism.
Right.
The one that's also an isomorphism.
I got it. It's an endomorphism that's also bijective, so it's a reversible transformation within the same structure. Think of it as an internal symmetry operation.
An internal symmetry, how would that manifest?
Well, automorphisms could model things like perspective shifts or maybe renamings that change absolutely nothing essential about the internal structure.
Okay, for me, the words happiness and joy are truly perfect synonyms. They mean exactly the same thing in every context.
Right.
Then swapping those words everywhere in my internal thoughts or narrative about a particular happy experience, that changes nothing about the underlying meaning or feeling for me.
That's a fantastic example. That swap would be an automorphism of your internal semantic network related to that feeling. It's a relabeling that leaves the relational structure and all the possible inferences you could draw completely unchanged.
The mind could even use this to test its own consistency. Like if I try swapping two words I think are synonyms and suddenly the meaning breaks or feels wrong.
Then they weren't true synonyms after all. The mapping didn't preserve the structure. It wasn't an automorphism. It reveals an inconsistency in your internal lexicon.
So automorphisms reveal these internal symmetries, these invariances. They help distinguish which aspects of an internal experience are truly fundamental, structural, versus which are just superficial labels or perspectives that can be changed without altering the core meaning or predictive value.
Precisely. If you can mentally rearrange elements within a thought or a memory, shuffle things around without changing its overall significance or how it connects to other thoughts, that rearrangement is an automorphism. It tells you that the structural pattern, not the specific arrangement or labeling, is what carries the fundamental content for you.
The paper mentions that automorphisms form a group, mathematically. What's the significance of that?
It means you can combine them. If you perform one symmetry operation and then another, the result is still a symmetry operation. You can reverse them. There's an identity operation, doing nothing.
So, in the mind.
It suggests a kind of robustness or coherence. You could layer multiple perspective shifts, different relabelings, and still arrive back in an internal state that is structurally equivalent to where you started. A mind with many automorphisms might be very stable. You can change superficial aspects, but the core predictions and meanings remain solid. It points to a deep internal coherence.
So searching for automorphisms is like searching for what can change without changing the essential meaning, finding the invariance.
Exactly. It's like testing the boundaries and the deep structure of your own internal world. Seeing what's truly invariant under transformation. Those invariants are the stable semantic content in this framework. Endomorphisms model the continuous flow of experience that maintains structure over time. Automorphisms model the hidden symmetries that make certain internal changes inconsequential.
And category theory gives a formal language for all these internal self-relations.
Yes, and the only reality check needed is internal consistency. Can I transform this experience this way and still have it make sense within my network? The math lets us frame that question rigorously.
It's a powerful idea, consistency from within. Okay, so that covers transformations within structures. What about how structures relate in terms of parts and wholes, like how one structure might be contained within another?
Right. That brings in the concepts of monomorphisms and epimorphisms. They model ideas like embedding and covering.
Monomorphism first, that's the injective one, right? The one-to-one map that doesn't collapse distinct elements.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
Think of it as an embedding. It maps one structure into another structure in a way that faithfully represents the source, preserving all its distinctions.
How does that apply mentally?
Well, think about accurately recalling a past experience in detail.
Okay, so I'm bringing fragments of a past mental state, a memory, into my present consciousness.
Right. If your recall is accurate, if it preserves the distinct details, then that process can be modeled as a monomorphism. It maps the structure of the stored memory fragments into your current mental workspace. Each distinct element from the past, who said what, where something was, the sequence of events maps to a distinct counterpart in your present mental representation. Its individual identity is preserved.
So if my memory gets fuzzy and I start blurring together two different people who were there, or I forget who said a specific thing.
That's a failure of the mapping to be monomorphic at that point. You've collapsed distinct elements. Monomorphisms, therefore, that model internal accuracy, specificity, keeping things differentiated.
If an internal element A maps monomorphically into a larger context B, its unique identity is preserved within that bigger picture.
Precisely. Like your concept of an apple needs to embed monomorphically into your broader knowledge category of fruit in a way that doesn't confuse it with your concept of an orange. They both sit inside fruit, but they remain distinct.
And in a purely self-contained system, this is crucial because there's no external world providing independent labels or boundaries. Internal precision comes from how things embed without losing their distinctness.
Exactly. Differentiation isn't about matching external differences. It's about ensuring distinct internal elements are preserved when situated within larger internal structures. A monomorphism essentially says this piece fits into the bigger picture neatly, keeping its unique shape.
Okay. And epimorphism is sort of the dual idea, the surjective one, the covering map.
Roughly, yes. The idea is that the source structure covers the target structure entirely. Every part of the target structure can be traced back to, or is generated from, something in the source.
How would that work mentally?
Imagine you have a set of core internal principles, or foundational experiences. If those principles epimorphically map onto your entire worldview,
It means
every belief, every concept you hold can be traced back to, or is generated by, some combination or consequence of those foundational principles or experiences. There are no fundamental gaps, no unexplained elements in your worldview that aren't somehow covered by your core starting points.
It sounds a bit like the old empiricist idea that all complex ideas are ultimately built up from simple sense impressions. The set of sense impressions epimorphically maps onto the set of all ideas.
You could definitely frame it that way within this mathematical structure. Epimorphisms get linked to ideas of explanatory adequacy and predictive completeness. If you have an internal model, the source structure, and it's supposed to predict or account for a stream of incoming experiences, the target structure, then your model structure needs to be rich enough to generate or map onto all aspects of that experience. It needs to be an epimorphism onto the experience.
So, if my mental model of how people behave successfully predicts everything I observe in a new social interaction,
then your model epimorphically covers that experience, you could say. There were no baffling moments, no behaviors that fell completely outside your model's generative or predictive capacity.
But if someone does something totally unexpected, something my model just cannot account for.
Yeah, your prior mental structure wasn't epimorphic relative to that new experience. There was structure in the experience that wasn't generated by or didn't map from your existing model. That signals a gap in your internal knowledge, a place where your model fails to cover the territory of experience.
So in this radical phenomenalist view, epimorphisms represent the ideal of a complete and coherent internal system. where one set of experiences or an internal theory can successfully generate or account for all other relevant experiences. It's like a closed loop of internal knowledge.
Right. We sort of intuitively strive for our internal theories or worldviews to be epimorphisms, mapping from some foundational set of experiences or principles onto all the phenomena we encounter or consider. This aligns nicely with coherentist theories of knowledge, where justification isn't about matching an external reality, but about the internal consistency and explanatory power within your belief system. Does the structure cover everything you know without internal contradictions?
Okay, so summing up these two. Monomorphisms give internal precision, keeping things distinct when embedded. Epimorphisms give internal completeness, ensuring everything is accounted for or generated by the internal structure. They describe these crucial part-whole relationships within the mental universe itself.
That's a very good summary. A specific concept embeds monomorphically into a broader category, keeping its identity. A comprehensive internal theory aims to epimorphically project onto potential experiences, accounting for all of them. These purely structural virtues are what could, in theory, keep a self-contained internal system tight and coherent, even without any external reference points.
All right, we've covered different kinds of structure-preserving maps within a single domain, or how one domain embeds in another. But I mean, the mind clearly has vastly different kinds of internal activity, doesn't it? Raw sensation, abstract thought, language, emotion, memory. How do these fundamentally different internal worlds, these different categories of experience, relate to each other?
Ah, yes, that's a crucial question. And this is where the concept of functors becomes absolutely central to the argument.
Functors, okay, what are they?
Functors are mappings between categories. They are the bridges that connect these different internal domains.
So they don't just map individual things like morphisms do. They map entire structures to other structures. They map objects and the morphisms between them.
Exactly. And crucially, they preserve the structural relationships at the level of the category itself. Think of it less like translating individual words between languages and more like translating the entire language, including its grammar and syntax, into another language, ensuring the relationships between words and sentences are preserved.
Okay, so give me an example. A functor from the category of, say, percepts to the category of concepts.
That's a perfect example they use. Such a functor would map a specific perceptual experience, like seeing a round, red, shiny object, to the corresponding abstract concept, the concept apple.
Right.
But it also maps the relationships you perceive between objects, like the relationship of peeling between an apple and its skin, to corresponding conceptual relations. The concept that an apple can be peeled, which relates the apple concept to the peeling action concept. A well-behaved functor ensures that the structure of relationships present in your perceptual experience is faithfully reflected in your conceptual framework.
I see. And then maybe another functor going from the category of concepts to the category of language.
Precisely. The concept apple maps to the word apple. And perhaps a conceptual relationship like agent eats object maps onto a grammatical structure like subject-verb-object in English.
So functorial mappings are proposed as the mechanism that ensures, for instance, that our language preserves the structure of our thoughts.
That's the idea. And by chaining these functors together, maybe percepts, concepts, language, you build a coherent pathway that links different levels of internal abstraction and activity.
And ideally, all these internal translations or mappings should line up properly. Seeing something, forming a concept, and then describing it should all be consistent internally.
Yes, and that consistency is captured formally by something called a commutative diagram that spans multiple categories connected by these functors.
Ah, commutative diagrams again.
Yes, but now connecting different types of mental domains. These diagrams show how functors enforce coherence across these different internal systems: perception, thought, language, memory, etc. In this radical phenomenalist model, functors provide the formal mechanism for how the mind performs internal reference across these distinct domains.
So just to be clear, my visual experience of seeing an apple doesn't refer to an external apple out there.
Nope.
Instead, it triggers the internal concept apple via a functor. And that concept might trigger the internal word apple via another functor. The meaning isn't about the external object, but about this consistent chained sequence of internal mappings.
That is the core idea, exactly. The meaningful coordination of all your internal subsystems, seeing, thinking, speaking internally, isn't orchestrated by some external world conductor. It's orchestrated by these systematic, structure-preserving functorial relations that allow the different parts of your mind to talk to each other consistently.
What happens if a mapping is off? Say, my perception to concept functor is misfiring, and I see a bright red tomato, but internally it maps to my apple concept.
Well, that would represent a failure, a misalignment. The diagrams involving that faulty functor wouldn't commute. You'd have an internal inconsistency.
And presumably that inconsistency gets flagged somehow.
Often, yes. It might be corrected by subsequent experience, like trying to bite the apple and tasting tomato, or by other internal checks and balances, your knowledge that apples grow on trees, tomatoes on vines, etc. The mind, in this view, is constantly striving to make its internal diagrams commute to ensure that all pathways of internal reference and transformation agree with each other. That's how it forges one coherent internal reality from sight, sound, thought, language, and memory.
Functors can also do something else interesting, right? They can highlight similarities in structure between very different domains, like relating the plot structure of a novel to the thematic development in a symphony.
Absolutely. That's a fantastic application. You could potentially define a functor that maps the temporal structure, the narrative arcs, the development of themes from the category representing the novel to the category representing the symphony.
And if that functorial mapping works, if it produces a commutative diagram,
it reveals a deep underlying structural correspondence between the two, even though their surface content words versus musical notes is utterly different. It provides a powerful formal basis for understanding creativity, analogy between different art forms, and spotting deep patterns across seemingly unrelated areas of our experience.
Wow, so functors are like these essential bridges of resonance, maybe? Ensuring that the different parts of the mind play in harmony, preserving the core structural score across different modalities, different instruments?
That's a wonderful analogy. They provide the systematic mapping that ensures consistency across the board. And this internal consistency, guaranteed by the functors, is what compensates for the absence of an external conductor telling everything how to line up.
Which brings us right back to commutative diagrams, but maybe thinking about them now on a much larger scale, modeling the coherence of the mind as a whole system.
Exactly. We've seen them pop up a few times. At its heart, a commutative diagram is just a diagram of objects, like mental states or concepts, and arrows, the morphisms or functors connecting them, where the key property is this. All possible paths you can trace from one starting object to one ending object must yield the exact same result.
It's the fundamental check for internal consistency.
Precisely. If there are multiple internal pathways to reach a certain conclusion or expectation or mental state, then all those pathways absolutely must agree for the system to be coherent.
Like the paper's example, think about predicting a glass shattering when dropped.
Okay.
You might have one internal pathway based on remembering specific instances of glasses falling and breaking. You might have another pathway based on applying your abstract knowledge about fragility, gravity, and hard surfaces.
Right. Memory versus logical deduction.
Both of those internal paths should lead to the same expected outcome, the image and sound of shattering glass.
Yes. If one internal pathway somehow predicts it bounces, while the other predicts it shatters, then your internal knowledge base is inconsistent. Something in your network of concepts, memories, or inferential rules doesn't commute. The internal references are contradicting each other.
So truth, then, in this radical phenomenalist view, it's fundamentally about this internal coherence, not matching an outside world.
That's the core argument, yes. A statement or belief is considered true within your system if it fits seamlessly into the vast interconnected network of your internal experience and concepts without breaking any commutative diagrams.
It's true if it doesn't introduce contradictions or ambiguities when you map it around using different internal pathways.
Exactly. Think about your concept of an apple. The diagram representing your experience, concepts, and language related to apples commutes. If translating between seeing an apple, thinking about its properties, internally saying the word apple, and remembering past apples, all yield a stable, consistent cluster of confirmations within your internal system.
But if I see an apple, think apple, but then the word that automatically comes to mind internally is banana.
That diagram doesn't commute. There's an internal semantic error. And the system fixes it, ideally, by adjusting the internal mappings, the morphisms and functors involved, until consistency is restored, until the diagrams commute again.
This sounds a bit like pragmatist ideas of truth, where truth is about what works reliably and consistently within a larger framework.
It definitely has that flavor. It's about maximizing structural coherence internally. Structural resonance is maximized when every loop in the internal network closes properly, meaning all paths commute.
It's like the internal equivalent of predictive coding's error minimization loop in the brain.
Very much so. This system updates its internal mappings to reduce inconsistencies between different internal signals or predictions or memories.
But crucially, in this view, the system isn't minimizing error relative to some external truth signal.
No, it's minimizing error relative to its own internal self-consistency and its success in predicting future internal states based purely on past internal patterns. The standard of truth is simply, does the internal simulation run smoothly? Does it avoid contradictions? Does it successfully anticipate the next frame of experience within its own terms?
You could almost imagine the entire mind as one gigantic, incredibly complex commutative diagram.
That's a powerful metaphor they suggest. Nodes are concepts, experiences, memories, perceptions. Arrows are all the relations, inferences, associations, transformations, the morphisms and functors connecting them. And the integrity, the coherence, maybe even the sanity of the mind requires that this whole vast diagram strives towards commutativity. Any two paths connecting any 2 points should ideally yield the same result.
So things like cognitive dissonance, illusions, paradoxes, are these basically instances where the diagrams fail to commute, points of breakdown.
Exactly. They represent points of structural inconsistency or tension within the internal network. And the mind tries to resolve them by reinterpreting, by learning, by adjusting beliefs, essentially, by tweaking the mappings or restructuring parts of the diagram to restore commutativity and coherence.
It's like tuning an instrument. Consistent structure yields harmonious notes. Inconsistency is dissonance. The commutative diagram is the condition for internal harmony.
That's a beautiful way to put it. And it's interesting because in mathematics, commutative diagrams often signal deep underlying natural relationships or conserved quantities. In this internal semantic framework, maybe meaning itself is the conserved quantity, the thing that's preserved across all the different internal transformations and translations, guaranteed by the commutativity of the diagrams.
So what I mean by something stays stable, regardless of whether I'm thinking about it conceptually, perceiving it directly, remembering it, or talking about it internally, as long as the mappings between those internal states align properly and commute. The commutativity ensures that stable core meaning persists through transformations.
That's the profound implication. So, stepping back, what does all this imply more broadly for how we think about cognition, knowledge, maybe even philosophy itself?
Well, for starters, it offers this view of cognition as a category, right? Mental states are the objects, mental operations or relations are the morphisms. The focus shifts dramatically from what a mental state is in isolation
to how it relates to and transforms other states structurally, how it fits into the network.
Which resonates really strongly with network-based views of the brain and mind that are popular now.
Absolutely. And learning in this picture becomes the process of adding new structure, new objects, new morphisms, new functors to your internal category. Or maybe refining the existing ones to improve the overall commutativity, the coherence. Knowledge isn't just storing facts, it's about constructing and skillfully navigating these structural mappings within your own mental category. It's a very dynamic, process-oriented perspective.
And it proposes an entire epistemology, a theory of knowledge that remarkably doesn't rely on external reference at all.
Right. Justification for holding a belief comes purely from its structural coherence. Does it slot neatly into your existing internal network? Does it respect the rules of embedding, monomorphisms, and covering, epimorphisms? Does it align properly via functors with other domains? Does it maintain commutativity?
So error isn't a mismatch with an external fact.
No. Error is detected as an internal inconsistency. A hallucination, sure, it doesn't match external reality. But in this view, its fundamental error lies in its failure to commute with the inputs from your other senses, or with your established conceptual knowledge. It creates internal dissonance.
A delusion might persist because the functorial mappings between certain concepts and evidence or predictions are somehow broken or rerouted, leading to internal contradictions that the system fails to resolve.
Exactly. The system debugs itself by optimizing for internal consistency. Now, from an external observer's perspective, this process might look like the mind gradually aligning itself with external reality.
But internally, it's just structural optimization, making the simulation run better.
Precisely. And what's really exciting, potentially, is what this implies for the future of philosophical semantics, the study of meaning.
How so?
If meaning is fundamentally about internal structure, then category theory provides this incredibly rich, rigorous formal language to actually model it.
So instead of linguistic expressions referring to things or sets of things out there in the world,
they map to objects and morphisms within the internal category of concepts. The truth of a sentence like, all birds can fly, isn't about checking every bird in the external world. It's about whether the corresponding diagram of concepts and relations within your conceptual category commutes properly, or whether a specific structural relationship, like a morphism representing can fly, connects appropriately from the bird concept.
So maybe the sentence, all apples are fruit, is internally true for me if my concept apally maps monomorphically, embeds neatly without loss of identity into my concept fruit within my internal conceptual category.
Yeah, something like that. If apally is structurally contained within fruit in the right way, this kind of framework, because it focuses on the structure of internal relationships, could potentially handle tricky things like intentional context, beliefs, desires, metaphors, and subtle meaning differences much more naturally than traditional semantics.
And what about compositionality in language, how we build complex meanings from simpler parts?
That could be modeled beautifully by functors mapping the grammatical structure of sentences, which itself forms a category, onto the semantic structure of concepts and relations. Another category. Category theory is actually already used in cutting-edge computational linguistics and cognitive science for exactly this kind of modeling.
Right.
This paper just takes the radical philosophical step of saying these internal structures aren't just models of meaning, they are the entirety of meaning. There's nothing else.
And that idea you mentioned earlier, structural resonance as understanding.
Yes. To understand something new, to really get it, is fundamentally about finding a reliable morphism, maybe an isomorphism, or at least a strong homomorphism, between that new thing and something already deeply structured and understood within your existing mental repertoire.
That aha moment.
That aha moment could be the feeling of completing a previously missing piece of a commutative diagram, or suddenly recognizing a deep structural symmetry, an isomorphism between the new problem and an old one.
That has huge implications for teaching and learning, doesn't it? It suggests teaching isn't just about transmitting facts, but about actively helping students build those structural connections.
Exactly. Building the right morphisms and functors in the student's mind. Helping them construct bridges and find those isomorphisms between what they already know and the new material they need to learn. It's about facilitating structural integration.
What about limitations, though? Does this very structural view struggle with the raw feel of experience? Qualia, subjectivity, it feels very abstract, very mathematical.
That's a fair point, and the paper touches on it. A committed radical phenomenalist might respond by arguing that qualia, the redness of red, the feeling of pain, aren't somehow outside this structure. They are perhaps the foundational objects within the internal category.
So they don't have structure, they are structure. Or part of it.
Or maybe their significance, their meaning within the system comes entirely from their relational roles, how they connect to other objects, other qualia, concepts, responses, via morphisms within the larger structural web. Their supposed ineffability doesn't necessarily mean they lack structure, just that they might be the atomic elements whose meaning is defined by their unique place and connections within the network, rather than by some further decomposition or mapping to something else.
So we understand a specific feeling, like sadness, by how it transforms under certain conditions, how it typically relates to other feelings or concepts or behaviors within our internal system.
Possibly. They are known by their place in the structure, even if that structure is incredibly fine-grained and complex at the level of raw feels.
It also sounds like you could potentially apply this kind of framework to thinking about artificial intelligence, couldn't you?
Oh, absolutely. An AI wouldn't necessarily need external sensors or a connection to our physical world to develop its own kind of internal meaning or simulated reality. It could, in theory, just simulate its own world internally and build up its own category of internal experiences and structural relationships.
That's a really fascinating, maybe slightly unnerving extension. The AI's understanding, or consciousness in this view, would simply be the complexity, coherence, and predictive power of its internal category structure.
And for us humans, it provides a potential framework for understanding experiences that are cut off from direct external input, like dreaming or maybe immersive virtual reality.
Exactly. How does the mind sustain meaning and navigate these worlds? Purely through internal consistency and the richness of its internal structural mappings. A dream feels meaningful or logical within itself if it possesses internal narrative coherence, an internal structure that commutes, even if it bears no resemblance to external waking reality. And finally, it seems to find ways to bridge different philosophical perspectives, even while being quite radical.
It certainly shares that intense focus on structure with philosophies like structural realism. The main difference is the arena. Structural realism tends to locate that crucial structure out there in the world.
Whereas radical phenomenalism plants its flag firmly in here, inside subjective experience, as the sole stage where meaning and reality play out. Structure is key, but it's internal structure.
Precisely.
Okay, so to try and bring this pretty intense deep dive to a close, we've really explored this incredibly bold, maybe unsettling idea that meaning, reality, everything we know might not be anchored by an external world at all. Instead, it might be entirely constructed and held together by the intricate web of structural relationships within our own minds.
And that these internal structures can potentially be mapped, understood, using the rigorous language of category theory concepts like morphisms, functors, and the crucial consistency checks provided by commutative diagrams.
In this view, reference isn't about pointing outwards.
It's internal resonance, structural alignment within the mind.
And truth isn't about correspondence to some outside fact.
It's internal structural integrity, coherence. Does it commute?
And it's important to remember the paper isn't necessarily denying the practical usefulness of talking about an external world. We obviously use that concept, that internal model, very effectively.
Right. But it reframes that concept itself, the external world, as just another sophisticated, highly consistent element within our internal simulation. It's subject to the same internal structural criteria of coherence and predictive success as everything else inside the theater of experience.
It really offers a potentially rigorous, almost mathematical language to describe the deeply subjective landscape of conscious experience, while still having room for things like metaphor and analogy as powerful tools for revealing that internal structure.
It definitely turns things inside out.
So here is a final thought, maybe something for you, our listener, to sit with after this deep dive. What does it genuinely feel like? What does it truly mean for your own personal sense of reality, your understanding of truth, if they are ultimately defined not by matching something out there, but by the internal consistency, the structural harmony of your own mind? Could your consciousness be, in a very real sense, a self-contained universe of forms held together entirely by this intricate internal structural logic?
Keep mapping those internal territories.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. We'll catch you next time.